I think of the wisdom students as people who are, in a very authentic way, searching for a meaningful spiritual context in their lives. In a context, in a world in which the old religious dogmas don't seem to hold. A world dominated by science, a world in which there have been immense scientific discoveries, and also a world in which we're beginning to understand the full potentials of the human mind and the way how any religious symbol opens up into a much wider world that goes beyond it. Now, William James was one of the first people to ask the relevant questions here about how do we establish a spiritual life in this changing intellectual context, and what does it mean? We're calling the course the Transpersonal William James, and that's in recognition of the fact that perhaps the most effective answers to those questions in our time come out of what we call the transpersonal movement. The movement in psychology in beginning in the late 60s with Abraham Maslow and Stan Grof, in which psychology was beginning to discover, full potentials of the human mind and its capacities that stretched far beyond the capacities of our ordinary rational consciousness. It turns out that the transpersonal psychologists were not the first people to look at this at all. A circle around William James developed at the very end of the 19th century that was interested in, first of all, the human mind and its potential in a scientific way. It was the beginning of psychology, but also who recognized that it had untold spiritual possibilities. They began to look into the full potential of the human mind and to investigate things such as that were on the edge of the scientific materialistic way of looking at things, which they knew was not fully satisfactory. They looked into things such as mediums and hypnosis, extraordinary knowledge, what James called consciousness beyond the margins, meaning the margins of our everyday life. Mysticism. The whole study of mysticism as an academic phenomenon goes back to William James, and it dominates discussion in the kind of realms that are drawn to Wisdom University. But the term really didn't have much currency before James launched it in the varieties of religious experience. So we have here somebody who was interested in these questions not only intellectually, but who felt them passionately. And it's really, he became known as a founder of American pragmatism, a major figure in American philosophy. But unbeknownst to the dominant academic community, even today, he spent so much of his life investigating questions that push the edges of the scientific worldview. He said, at one point he said, our science is a drop, our ignorance an ocean. He knew that we could just go so far beyond the materialistic interpretation of things. And he looked for giving that search a solid intellectual and philosophical foundation, and ended up doing that in a way in which transpersonal psychology and I think our own personal quests can stand. They can stand on that foundation. For him, it was a very personal question. It wasn't simply an intellectual one. He faced his own dark nights of the soul, his own crises. He had his own spiritual experiences. He came out of although he plunged himself into the scientific world around him, he had come out of a transcendentalist worldview as embodied by his father, who was something of a religious mystic himself, and he was trying to pull together these these two worlds of religion and science, of spirituality and investigation of the material world. And he did it in a way that opened so many questions that we're still, that even now we see as central questions. And I'll finish with just one of them. He had, he lived at a time in which people were beginning to localize functions of the human brain, and he followed that research very closely. But he wasn't satisfied with the material interpretation that all consciousness comes out of chemical, electrical, physical processes of the human brain, because that would put an end to the spiritual search. It also puts an end to the notion of any kind of life beyond the life we know. And he was open to those questions. So he really is the originator of what's sometimes called the transmission or filter theory of the brain, whereby consciousness is not something that's simply produced in an individual human cerebrum, but it is filtered through or transmitted through these processes that go on in our heads. And in that process, he expanded the notion of what consciousness really meant. He and some of his cohorts were among the first to try to systematically look at the subliminal mind before thought. They're looking at the unconscious mind and how to map out that territory. And they did it in a way in which they recognized that we live in a very limited sphere of what the human mind can do, and that it has capacities that are supernormal by our point of view, that can stretch into great mystical, first of all, to knowledge that could not be available in our ordinary lives, to supernormal knowledge, as I said, but also into the insights of the great mystics, and that knowledge was something that the world needed to pay attention to, that we need to look at what kind of a world is portrayed through the other ways of knowing than our rational mind. So one of his great quests was to look at all the different ways that religious zealots of all kinds, what their religious experience was really like, and then just try to see what those experiences had in common. And he came up with answers that I think should be fascinating to the students of the wisdom graduate school today.